Okay, hi gang, welcome to week 3 online. Our theme this week is feminist theories of justice. I've got 2 short videos. The first is really just to explain what justice is, and that's what this video is. And the second is to look at different theories of justice. So by the end of watching this video, you're going to understand what we mean by the notion of justice and why it's such an important concept for us as a country right now. And so let's jump in. And we're going to look at that using a tool that folks who are engaged in social change work often use when trying to really address and identify the kind of work that social change or that justice might require. And they do this thing called a problem tree, where you identify what an issue might be, a social problem or a social issue, and then you start to be as clear as you possibly can about the impacts of that problem. The places, perhaps the symptoms or the evidence or the way that that problem manifests itself, the way that we know that it's a problem. And then after you spend a little time doing that, then you try to get at the root causes of that issue or that problem. And one of the main reasons for doing this activity is that we tend to, as a society, as Americans, we tend to, and particularly as people of faith, we tend to spend a lot of time addressing the impact of social problems, the need that social problems create, the symptoms or really the symptoms that we see in our societies or our communities. And all of that is very important, but one of the problems is that we get very preoccupied with the impact and we don't spend enough time looking at root causes and trying to figure out what caused this issue in the first place. We need both, but without looking at root causes, we're looking at a never-ending need. So let's think about this in the context of a problem that we're seeing in our country right now to make this point clear. Scientists, healthcare providers are indicating that we're seeing higher rates of COVID-19 infection and mortality among African Americans in the United States. African Americans make up roughly 13% of the US population, but they are much higher, represented in much higher numbers in terms of rates of infection or in rates of mortality. So doing this problem tree exercise, we could identify or see what some of the symptoms or the evidence of that. How do we know that's true, or where do we see this problem showing up? And certainly we're seeing more people showing up in hospitals, more African Americans showing up in hospitals. We know that certain hospitals in certain parts of the country are more inundated depending on the size of the African American population that those hospitals serve. We're seeing more Black families impacted by the disease and by mortality rates. So we've got evidence. And there's certainly a lot of work that's being done to try to address those immediate symptoms and needs, making sure that we have more hospital beds available, making sure that resources are flowing to urban centers where we can anticipate higher rates of infection, right? Those would be examples of trying to address the need or the impact. But folks who are engaged in social change work, folks who are engaged in justice work, are going to be people who are starting to ask themselves the question, why? Why is it that we see higher rates of COVID-19 infection and mortality among African Americans? So if we think about the work that happens above the surface in this problem tree, the work that we can see addressing the symptoms as direct service, or to use religious language, charity work, justice is the work that happens below the surface when we start to ask questions about root causes. So again, thinking about why there might be higher rates of COVID-19 infection among African Americans, we can start to name some of the reasons that might be the case. We know that African Americans have less access to healthcare. They work in jobs are more likely to work in jobs where healthcare is not provided. We know that healthcare is an expense, and that if you are working a lower wage job that doesn't offer you healthcare, you're going to be less able to afford purchasing healthcare on your own. So therefore, you're going to be more prone to pre-existing conditions for COVID-19, things like diabetes, things like asthma or other respiratory issues, because of a lack of ongoing preventative care that is available to you, right? We also could say, well, why is it that we have higher rates of COVID-19 infection infection among African Americans. Think back to what we read with Ada Maria Asasi Diaz and exploitation, right? That there are a lot of people who are saying the people who we are deeming as essential workers right now are also people who tend to be making lower wages and also tend to be people disproportionately minority, disproportionately Black. And so we know, again, if those people are the people who have to go to work and who are making less money, they're also more likely to expose themselves, or be exposed rather, to the disease, because let's say they rely on public transportation to get to work because they can't afford a car, or maybe because they have lack of access to healthy food. That would be something else that would be a root cause for higher rates of infection. So again, justice work is going to be about trying to get at the root causes. So another way that we could look at this dichotomy is that we could say that charity work is the work of addressing the leaves and the branches in the problem tree, addressing the symptoms. And charity is usually individual acts that respond to immediate need. They provide a one-to-one or an immediate direct service. And they really are looking at the symptoms, right? The symptoms being like, what are the symptoms of COVID-19? What are the things that manifest themselves so that we know that we have this problem on our hands? Whereas justice, on the other hand, gets at the root causes, is working below the surface. So it's going to be much more collective in that work. It's going to be about making public statements or public actions. It's going to really attempt to respond to long-term needs. So the work of justice right now, and justice workers are saying, look, COVID-19 is exposing all sorts of disparities right now in our country that need to be addressed. That I've heard it put this way, that COVID is the virus, but capitalism is really the pandemic. Capitalism in the United States that has created such disproportionate gaps in wealth, that we have so many people who are not making a decent wage, that's going to make them more susceptible to disease. So justice is going to be about responding to those long-term needs. And again, we said justice is going to get at root causes, right? So let me wrap it with that, and then stay tuned for slide number 2, where I give you some basic definitions of what justice is. Great. Thank you for your attention.